Someone stop him. Two security officers moved before Bernard Thibodeau had taken 3 steps toward the exit. The old man turned slowly, his face carrying the particular bewilderment of someone who has just been accused of something they cannot comprehend. "I beg your pardon?" Claudia Firth stood near the concierge desk, one perfectly manicured hand resting on her Louis Vuitton clutch, the other pointing directly at him. Her voice carried effortlessly across the marble lobby of the Hartwell, Toronto's most exclusive hotel. "That man took my earring. I watched him." "Madame, I didn't." "I saw you." Her voice sharpened like a blade. "You were standing right beside me at the jewelry display case. Don't embarrass yourself further." A small crowd had already formed. Guests paused mid-stride. A concierge reached for his phone. 2 people near the elevator bank lifted their own devices, recording. Nobody moved to help. Elise Bouchard had been on her way back from the restaurant with an empty tray when she heard it. She was 29 years old and had worked at the Hartwell for 4 years. She knew every corner of this lobby, every marble tile, every guest who treated the staff like furniture, and everyone who said, "Thank you." She had learned, over those 4 years, when to stay invisible, and when something could not be ignored. She set her tray quietly on the nearest surface. Bernard Thibodeau was perhaps 75. He wore a pressed charcoal blazer over a pale blue shirt, and he carried himself with the careful dignity of a man who had spent a lifetime earning respect. His hands, Elise noticed, were shaking slightly, not from guilt, but from shock. "Sir," one of the security officers said, "we'll need you to come with us." "He'll do no such thing." The words were out of Elise before she had fully decided to say them. She stepped forward, placing herself squarely between Bernard and the officers. She was not a small woman, she never had been, and right now she used every inch of that presence. Claudia Firth's gaze swept over her with the practiced contempt of someone who sorted people by category at a glance. "Excuse me, who are you?" "My name is Elise Bouchard. I'm a server here." Elise kept her voice steady. "And I'd like to know what evidence anyone has before they detain a guest in this lobby. I'm a guest too, and I watched." "You watched him stand near a display case. That's not theft." Something shifted in Claudia's expression. Not embarrassment, something colder. She stepped forward, and her voice dropped just enough to feel like a threat. "You need to remove yourself from this situation before you lose your job." Elise didn't move. "I mean it," Claudia raised her hand. The slap landed across Elise's left cheek before anyone in the room had time to react. The crack of it echoed off the marble floors and 15-foot ceilings in a way that seemed to silence the entire building. Elise didn't step back. She didn't raise her own hand. She simply turned her face forward again, the heat blooming across her skin, and looked Claudia Firth directly in the eye. "Lay your hand on him," Elise said quietly, "and I'll make sure every camera in this hotel captures exactly what just happened to me." The lobby held its breath. The hotel manager arrived within 4 minutes. The security footage was reviewed within 10. What it showed was straightforward. Bernard Thibodeau had paused briefly near the boutique's glass display before continuing toward the lobby. Claudia Firth had been standing beside the same display, speaking on her phone, her clutch balanced precariously on the counter edge. When she pulled out her phone with a sharp movement, the clutch tipped. A pearl and gold earring slid free and vanished into the lining of her own bag. The earring was still there. The room went completely quiet when the manager said so. Claudia's composure fractured for the first time. It must have." "The footage is clear, madam." The manager's tone was carefully neutral. "Mr. Thibodeau did not take your earring." A police officer who had been called as a precaution looked at Claudia with visible disapproval. "Before you make an accusation like that in a public space, it's generally a good idea to check your own belongings." The guests, who had been recording quietly, lowered their phones. Several walked away without meeting anyone's eyes. Claudia produced a short, rehearsed apology that fooled no one. Certainly not Bernard, who accepted it with a dignity that cost her far more than any shouting could have. Elise walked him to a chair near the window and brought him a pot of Earl Grey without asking. "You didn't have to do that," Bernard said, wrapping both hands around the warm cup. "I know. She hit you." "She did." Elise touched her cheek reflexively. It had stopped stinging. "Are you all right?" He looked at her for a long moment. "My son is going to ask me that question too." "I hope your son gets a more honest answer than most people give." Bernard smiled. It was the tired, warm smile of a man who had not expected kindness from a stranger today and was quietly undone by it. "You're very brave." Elise shook her head. "I just don't like watching people get hurt when I can do something about it." She left him with his tea and went back to work. The mark on her cheek had faded to a faint pink by the time her shift ended. That evening, in a building across the financial district that the public believed to be a private equity firm, Xavier Moreau loosened his tie for the first time all day. To the shareholders and business reporters who wrote about Moreau Capital, he was a precise, formidable CEO whose instincts had made the firm one of the most quietly powerful financial entities in the country. A man who moved money the way other men moved chess pieces. That was all true as far as it went. What the reporters did not know, what no newspaper would print and no rival would say aloud, was that the wealth Moreau Capital managed represented only the surface layer of what Xavier actually controlled. The Moreau Syndicate had existed for 3 generations. Xavier had inherited it at 32, restructured it at 35, and spent the decade since ensuring it ran with the cold precision of a machine that never needed to raise its voice. He ruled through reputation. The rumor of what he might do was more effective than the doing. That was the point. He was reviewing a property acquisition file when his personal phone rang. The number was his father's. "Papa." Xavier set the file aside immediately. His father called twice a week, on Sundays and Thursdays. Today was Tuesday. Bernard's voice was measured, but Xavier heard the slight tremor beneath it that had not been there a year ago. He listened without interrupting while his father described the afternoon. The accusation, the security officers, the lobby full of spectators, and the young woman who had stepped forward when no one else would. "She took the blow herself," Bernard said finally. "She didn't even flinch." Xavier said nothing for a moment. His father rarely described strangers with that particular quality of voice. "Her name?" "Elise. She works at the Hartwell." He hung up and called his head of operations within 40 seconds. The instructions were specific. Find her full name, her employment record. Nothing else without his direct authorization, and under no circumstances was she to be approached, surveilled in any way that would frighten her, or made aware that anyone was looking. His second-in-command, a deliberate man named Soren who had worked for the Moreaus for 11 years, paused on the line. "That's unusual, sir." "Find her," Xavier said, carefully. He sat at his desk for a long time after the call ended. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Toronto's downtown grid spread out in its ordered lights. And he thought about a woman who had stepped in front of a stranger and accepted a slap without blinking. Most people, in his experience, moved away from trouble, especially trouble that wasn't theirs. He found himself genuinely curious who moved toward it. 3 days passed before Elise Bouchard ran out of excuses to stop thinking about the old man in the charcoal blazer. She had worked a double shift on Wednesday, covered for a colleague on Thursday, and spent Friday's break reorganizing the server station with unnecessary thoroughness. None of it stopped her from wondering whether Bernard Thibodeau had gone home all right, whether the afternoon had shaken him more than he'd let on. She was refilling the cream dispensers Saturday morning when he walked in. "I was told the Earl Grey here is exceptional," Bernard said, settling into the same chair by the window as though it had been reserved for him. Elise felt something loosen in her chest. "We also have a very respectable Darjeeling." Another time. She brought the tea herself. They spoke for 20 minutes about the neighborhood, about a particular bookshop on Queen Street he'd been visiting for decades, about how the cold had come early this year and whether it would stay. Neither of them mentioned the lobby. He came back the following Tuesday and the Thursday after that. The visits became a quiet fixture of Elise's shifts. Bernard never stayed long, never made demands, never treated her as though she were performing a service. He asked questions and listened to the answers with the genuine attention of someone who had learned, over a long life, that most conversations were worth having. Elise's supervisor noticed. "Friend of yours?" "Not yet," Elise said. Then she thought about it. Maybe. She stopped correcting herself. Xavier Moreau first walked through the Hartwells' front doors on a Wednesday afternoon, carrying nothing and needing nothing, except the answer to a question he hadn't fully formed yet. Soren had provided the file. Elise Bouchard, 29, 4-year employee with a spotless record and 3 separate commendations from guests. No criminal history, no debts beyond a modest student loan she was paying down methodically. She owned 2 houseplants and a second-hand bicycle, and she had grown up in Timmins before coming south for university. There was nothing suspicious in any of it. No angle, no calculation, no hidden connection to anyone or anything. She had stepped in front of his father because she'd decided it was the right thing to do. That appeared to be the whole explanation. Xavier found this almost impossible to process. He sat in the restaurant and ordered a coffee and watched her work. She moved through the room with a quiet efficiency that suggested she had long since stopped wasting energy on what couldn't be controlled. She was funny. He caught fragments of her conversations with other tables, small, dry observations delivered with a precision that made people laugh without expecting to. She remembered orders without writing them down. She noticed when the elderly couple near the window was struggling with the menu and changed her approach without making them feel slow. She did not notice him watching. When she brought his coffee, she looked at him the way she looked at every table, directly, briefly, professionally. "Can I get you anything else?" "No, thank you." She nodded and moved on. She did not recognize him. There was no calculation in her gaze, no flicker of social positioning. To Elise Bouchard, he was a man in a good suit who'd ordered a black coffee at 2 in the afternoon. Xavier sat with that for a while. He came back the following week, and the week after. On his 4th visit, Bernard happened to be there for his Tuesday tea. Xavier sat 2 tables away and watched his father's laugh at something Elise had said. Actually laugh, the way he hadn't in the years since Xavier's mother had passed. He watched Elise refill the pot without being asked, watched her slip an extra shortbread onto the saucer and pretend she hadn't. For the first time in a very long time, Xavier Moreau felt something he could not immediately identify or control. He found it more alarming than anything his rivals had ever done. 6 weeks in, Bernard sat across from Elise between the lunch rush and the evening service and said, without much preamble, "My son is single." Elise set down the cloth she'd been folding. "I've been told that a few times lately." "By whom?" "By you, 3 weeks ago and again last Tuesday." Bernard had the grace to look mildly caught. It bears repeating. "It must." She picked the cloth back up. "Who is your son exactly? You've never actually told me." "He's in finance." "Aren't most of your generation's sons in finance?" Bernard laughed. "He's successful. He's serious, which people misread as cold. He's very loyal to the people he decides are worth it." He paused. "He visits me every week without being asked." "Okay, Now you're just listing his virtues. I'm being accurate. Elise was quiet for a moment. There was something she had been carrying since the lobby. Not the slap, but what had come after. The way she'd felt standing in a hotel full of expensive people, making herself large when everything in her had wanted to disappear. She had spent most of her life learning how to take up exactly the right amount of space, no more. Men like your son, she said finally, don't really see women built like me, not the way they see other women. She kept her voice matter-of-fact. She wasn't asking for reassurance, she was just being honest. Bernard looked at her for a long moment. You protected me, he said, when a lobby full of people with more money and more status and less courage stood there and did nothing. Do you have any idea how rare that is? It doesn't mean he'd. I know, my son. Bernard reached across and briefly covered her hand with his. He sees character before everything else. He'd have to. In his world, he can't afford not to. Elise smiled, unconvinced but warmed by it. She liked Bernard Thibodeau very much. She had stopped pretending otherwise. She didn't know that outside, in a black sedan, idling across from the hotel entrance, his son was sitting with a briefing file open on his lap that he had not read a single word of in 45 minutes. Xavier was watching the restaurant window, watching Elise laugh at something his father had said, watching her reach out and refill the teapot as naturally as breathing. He told himself he was still gathering information. He was not particularly convincing, even to himself. The Hartwell hosted the Brantwood Charity Foundation Gala on the second Friday of November. It was the kind of event that filled the hotel's grand ballroom with people who had very specific ideas about who deserved to be standing next to them. Elise was working it. Silver tray, black uniform, the particular posture she'd learned to maintain in rooms like this, present enough to be useful, invisible enough to go unnoticed. She was good at it. She had been good at it for years. She had almost made it through the cocktail hour without incident. Well, the voice came from her left, carrying the particular pitch of someone who wanted to be overheard. I didn't expect to see you here. Elise recognized Claudia Firth before she finished turning. The woman was in a strapless evening gown, the color of champagne, a glass in her hand, a particular kind of smile arranged on her face. Ma'am, Elise kept her voice neutral. Still serving other people's drinks, I see. Claudia looked her up and down with the slow, deliberate cruelty of someone who had practice at it. I suppose that's the only way someone like you gets into an event like this. Nearby guests shifted almost imperceptibly. Some looked away, some watched. Elise had heard variations of this her entire life. She knew how to absorb it. I'm here to do my job, Elise said. I'd appreciate you letting me do it. Your job? Claudia tilted her head. Not to throw yourself in front of people in hotel lobbies for attention. That wasn't for attention. No? Claudia stepped closer. Her voice dropped just low enough to feel intimate and cutting at once. I saw you looked absolutely thrilled with the little scene you created. Very touching. Very. She let her gaze move down and back up with a slowness designed to land. Brave for someone who clearly can't afford anything in this room. The ballroom had gone very quiet in their particular corner. Elise set her tray on the nearest surface. She looked at Claudia steadily and said, with perfect calm, I remember you claimed to see a great many things quite clearly last month. You were wrong then, too. Claudia's expression hardened. She reached out and wrapped her fingers around Elise's wrist, not gently. I think you need to find the service corridor. Let go of her arm. The voice was quiet, not raised, not theatrical. It simply landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water, and every ripple moved outward from where Xavier Moreau was standing. He had appeared from the edge of the crowd without seeming to move at all. He was in a black dinner jacket and he looked at Claudia Firth with the expressionless attention of someone who had already completed every calculation that mattered. Claudia's hand released Elise's wrist immediately. Xavier moved to stand beside Elise, not in front of her, not shielding her from view, but directly beside her, as though they were two people facing the room together. When he spoke again, his voice carried without effort across the entire hushed section of the ballroom. "The woman standing next to me," he said, "walked into this hotel's lobby 6 weeks ago. Every person in that lobby watched an elderly man be publicly accused and physically restrained. Not one of them moved." He paused for exactly long enough. She moved. She stood between him and a situation that was not hers. She accepted a blow that was meant for someone else. His eyes moved briefly to Claudia. She did that for a man she had never met, without asking who he was, what he owned, or what she might receive in return. He looked back at the room. "That man is my father." The silence in the ballroom shifted into something larger. "You have now treated her badly twice," he continued, and his voice remained utterly composed, which made it considerably more dangerous than shouting. "In a hotel where my family has held an account for 11 years. At a charity event my foundation co-sponsors." He tilted his head a fraction. "I'd encourage you to think very carefully about whatever you were planning to do next." Claudia Firth went pale in a way no amount of foundation could conceal. She left. No one stopped her. No one stood with her. The circle that had formed around the confrontation quietly dissolved, guests returning to their conversations with the slightly over-animated energy of people who had just witnessed something they were already composing in their heads for retelling. Xavier turned to Elise. Up close, he was more tired than she'd expected. There was something in his eyes she hadn't seen from across the restaurant. Something that looked oddly like relief. "Are you all right?" he asked. She looked at him, something snagged. "You've been in the restaurant the past few weeks." "I have." "You never said you were his son." "No." "Why not?" Xavier was quiet for a moment. Around them, the gala's noise had resumed. Soft music underneath the hum of conversation, the room proceeding as though nothing had happened. "Because I wanted to know who you were," he said finally, "before you knew anything about me." Elise studied his face. "And what did you find out?" He looked at her directly, not at her uniform, not at the tray she'd left behind, not at any of the things people usually catalogued when they sorted her into a category and moved on. "That you're the most genuinely decent person I've come across in a very long time," he said. "And that you've spent years convincing yourself no one looks at you for longer than it takes to figure out what you're useful for." The accuracy of it landed somewhere underneath her sternum. "You're wrong about that second part," he added, before she could speak, in case that wasn't clear. He offered his arm with the careful formality of someone who understood the gesture could be declined and was offering it anyway. Elise took it. He drove her home himself, through Toronto's wide nighttime streets, the first frost of the season, beginning to trace its patterns along the passenger window. The silence between them had the comfortable quality of people who have spent several weeks in the same room without knowing why, and have only just worked out the reason. She asked him, at a red light, "What do you actually do?" "All of it," he told her. Not because it was easy, but because she had asked honestly, and he did not know how to be anything other than honest with her now. He described the company. Then the other thing, not glorified, not minimized, simply true, the way facts are when a person has stopped performing around them. Elise was quiet for a long stretch of road after he finished. "You should have told me sooner," she said. "I know." "Why didn't you?" "Because I wanted one person in my life," he said, "who knew the man before they knew what the man runs." She looked out the window. The city passed in amber and white. "I own 2 houseplants and a bike," she said finally. "I'm aware." "And you're all of this?" "Yes." She was quiet again. Then, "I've spent half my life making myself smaller in rooms that weren't built for me. I've gotten very good at disappearing when it seemed like the safer option." I know, his voice was very quiet. "I don't want to disappear into someone else's world either." "That's not what I'm asking." He didn't look away from the road, but something in his bearing shifted, became more deliberate, more open. "I'm asking you to let someone see you clearly, completely. I'm asking because..." He paused for the length of a block. "I've been watching you for 6 weeks. The way you move through a room, the way you talk to my father, the way you looked in that lobby when you'd just been hit and you didn't flinch, not even a little." A pause. "You are extraordinary, Elise, not in spite of how you look. As yourself. Exactly and entirely as yourself." The stoplight ahead turned green. Neither of them moved until the car behind them offered a polite reminder. By spring, Bernard Thibodeau had taken to stopping by the Hartwell on the days Elise wasn't working, just to leave flowers with the front desk. Claudia Firth's membership with the Brantwood Foundation had been reviewed following formal complaints submitted by 3 separate witnesses to the gala incident. She was no longer involved in the event's planning committee. The hotel had quietly settled a complaint related to the lobby incident and revised its detainment procedures. The security officer who had grabbed Bernard without evidence had completed a remedial training program and submitted a written apology. Consequences, as it turned out, had been considerably more concrete than a ruined reputation. Elise had been promoted to senior floor supervisor. She had accepted without being asked twice. She was closing the restaurant on a Thursday evening in April. Chairs up on tables, city lights coming through the tall windows. When she heard the particular set of footsteps she had learned to distinguish from all the others in this building, Xavier sat on the edge of a table she had not yet turned down. He was in a jacket and no tie, which meant he'd come from something that had run long. "You're late," Elise said. "Call with Brussels." "How's Brussels?" "Irritating." She handed him the broom. "You can make yourself useful while you tell me about it." He took it without protest. Over the past several months, Xavier Moreau had become quite good at making himself useful in Elise's spaces. She suspected he had not had much practice at it before her, and she found this, quietly, her favorite thing about him. They swept the floor and he told her about Brussels. And she told him about the new sommelier who had dropped an entire case of Burgundy on his first day. And they laughed in the easy way of people who have discovered that the most ordinary evenings of their lives have become the best ones. When the floor was clean and the lights were half dimmed, Xavier set the broom aside and reached into his jacket pocket. Elise looked at the small dark box. Then she looked at him. "I'm not doing this at a gala," he said, "or in a room full of people, or anywhere that turns it into a performance. I'm doing it here, because here is where you are, and that's the only calculation I've made." She took a slow breath. "You told my father once," he said, "that you only did what you hoped someone would do for your own mother. I've thought about that for months." He opened the box. The ring inside was simple, not a display of what he could afford, but a thing that had been chosen carefully for a specific person. "I want to be the person who spends the rest of his life making sure no one has to hope that for you, that someone is always already there." Elise looked at the ring. The warmth gathering behind her eyes was the kind she had stopped being embarrassed by. "You're going to have to be considerably more annoying than this if you want me to say no," she said at last. Xavier laughed. The full one, the real one, the one she had decided months ago was her favorite sound in this city or any other. She held out her hand. Bernard Thibodeau, when told the news the following Sunday over dinner, said nothing for a full minute. Then he poured 3 glasses and raised his. "I knew," he said simply, "the moment she brought me tea." Nobody argued. because everyone at that table understood that some things are set in motion not by grand design or careful planning, but by a single ordinary morning when one person decides that a stranger ought not to stand alone. And everything good that follows grows, quietly and without fanfare, from exactly that.